Shalom, friends. Welcome to this installment of our Judaism Unplugged video series entitled Pur Pur Pitiful Me. Tonight, we take a look at the basics of the Jewish holiday of Purim, a holiday of the late winter, explaining its roots and its basic celebration so that all those who are aware of the holiday can understand it a little bit better, that those who celebrate it can recognize more in it than perhaps we sometimes do, and so that what can sometimes appear to be a very strange celebration becomes a point of understanding and a window of reflection rather than a reason for judgment. The holiday Purim is based upon the story in the biblical book of Esther. Esther is one of the 5 short books called Megillot, or scrolls, that are part of the third of the 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible, the Ketuvim, the writings. Each of those 5 Megillot are assigned to be read on a particular holiday. The book of Esther is assigned to Purim because, in very real sense, there is no celebration of Purim without the book of Esther. But don't get confused. I'm not at all suggesting that the book of Esther is a historical book on which an actual holiday is celebrated. Indeed, when one reads the book of Esther, Megillat Esther in Hebrew, one gets the very real sense that the original intent of this text was to be a lampoon, a burlesque, a text not to be taken seriously. And so one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, how does such a text find its way into the canonized collection that comprises Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible? And that's a very big discussion for another day, but we'll excerpt it here a little bit in just a moment. The festival of Purim is celebrated on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Adar, the 12th month in the cycle of the Jewish year when counting months. Late in winter, a month before Passover, which is the restart of the cycle in the first month in the spring. And I point out both the late winter location for this holiday on the calendar, as well as the temporal and fixed connection to the celebration of Passover, because both of those facts have parallels in other celebrations. Purim is a lighthearted, joyous, frequently thought of as kid-friendly holiday, whose primary modes of celebration are the reading of the text of the book of Esther in public, in synagogue, but not just the reading of the text with the solemnity that one would read Torah and other sacred texts. Indeed, when the book of Esther is read in synagogue on Purim, our young people and even our grown-ups are armed with harsh noisemakers called groggers. I have one right here. You can see what it looks like. You can hear the hideous sound it makes. And we are instructed that every time the name of the evil Haman is recited in the text, we are to blot it out with our noise, stamping our feet, waving our groggers. In the modern world, where we Jews try to bring an element of awareness of others and their needs of social action into most everything we do, we have even at times encouraged people to bring a unused box sealed of macaroni and cheese mix and use that as their grogger and then donate it afterwards. So the text is not read solemnly at all. It is read with that air of frivolity, of joyousness, of laughter, of almost mocking, at least of Haman, that is consistent throughout the holiday. Young people and even some adults dress up in costume to celebrate this holiday. There is a tradition of sending gift baskets to our neighbors. Think Halloween in reverse. Instead of young people showing up at your door and demanding a treat, or they will do something terribly bad to you that they call a trick in order to get it, which is the basis of Halloween, imagine, because this is what it is on Purim, kids in similar costume coming to your door, bringing you baskets of goodies from your neighbors as a gift to make sure you're okay here at this point in the late winter. The holiday is also celebrated by being aware of and taking care of the needs of the poor in our community. And the celebration of Purim is somewhat unique as well, in that for the adults, there is an expectation, if not an obligation, to drink to excess. The way that the ancient texts word it is that you should not be able to distinguish the phrase blessed is Mordecai from the phrase cursed is Haman. And trust me when I tell you that they sound no more alike in Hebrew or Aramaic than they don't in English. So if that's the yardstick, it's a rather significant amount of drinking that's expected of us to be able to reach that point of not being able to understand clearly. And I don't know that it was ever intended to be that over the top. I think that was an exaggeration to make the point that Purim is not like any other holiday. Purim is this just outrageous letting loose of all of our fears, anxieties, tensions in this almost bacchanal way. So back to the calendar. The fact that we have such a holiday observed in this way in the late winter lines Purim and its celebration up very well with the celebration of Mardi Gras and its wild excesses, especially in Carnival in Brazil and in New Orleans and in some of the places where Mardi Gras is most famously celebrated. But it also seems to line it up very well with St. Patrick's Day. And it's possible that all three have their basis in the idea that come the end of winter, we just need to let loose, to be excited that spring is coming, that we can return back to the outdoors. And there's a power in that natural outpouring of exuberance that gets channeled into this holiday of Purim. The connection between Purim and Mardi Gras also leaves open the calendar connection that Purim is always in the last month of the year and Passover is always in the first month of the Jewish year. Falling as Purim does in the month of Adar, when there's a Jewish leap year and a second month of Adar is added at the end of the cycle of months, Purim actually moves into the second Adar to maintain that 30-day space between Purim and Passover exactly. And in that respect, it is very similar to the concept of Lent that starts with Ash Wednesday, the day after Mardi Gras, and counts 40 days to Easter Sunday. And just as there seems to be a historical connection between Easter and Passover, therefore, as a result, at the other end, there appears to be at least a spirited, if not spiritual, linkage between the beginning of Lent and the celebration of Purim. So that's the basics. If you walk into a Jewish sanctuary, a Jewish congregation, if you are in Israel and walk into a Jewish community, you're quite likely to find Purim being celebrated in the streets in Israel, as well as in the synagogue, as well as in people's houses. And you'll see the costumes, and you'll hear the groggers, and you'll hear the exuberance and the crazy, joyous celebration. And you'll wonder what exactly it's all about, and you may not remember that it's all based upon a biblical book, the book of Esther. 10 chapters that seem likely to have been written originally as a lampoon or a Baroque burlesque. A story in which things are never quite what they appear to be. So, for example, in the book of Esther, God does not appear once by name. There are a couple of places where God's existence is hinted at, but nowhere is God mentioned by name. The two main heroes of the story, although there's at least one other hero who is worthy of consideration, are Mordecai and his cousin Esther, who becomes the queen of Persia, married to King Ahasuerus. The Persian king lists do not list a King Ahasuerus. Scholars think because of the similar sounds to their names, there might be a connection to Artaxerxes. I don't know, Artaxerxes, Ahasuerus don't exactly sound alike to me. Although the timing appears to be right for whatever historical kernel there is in the book of Esther to be from roughly the time of Artaxerxes. But Esther and Mordecai, as the two human heroes, or two of the three human heroes in this book of Esther, have names that bear a striking sound-alike familiarity to the Babylonian god Marduk and his consort Ishtar. Exactly the kind of burlesque and parody that one would expect in a story of Jewish salvation that does not mention our own God by name. That the character of King Ahasuerus is somewhat of a alcoholic, partying, not terribly effective king adds to the burlesque. If you read the Hebrew text carefully, there appear to be a bunch of places where there are double entendres in play, some of which may have rather mature overtones behind them, some of which occur at critical moments in the story, all of which indicates that this story was told not to educate, but to entertain. Scholars are still catching up with all of the details here, trying to make sense of the probably hidden history behind this. We Jews have not discussed this very much ourselves. So I leave it to another time for us to explore some of those issues, perhaps. You can certainly celebrate Purim without knowing any of that. And in the midst of this story being told in the sanctuary, children are parading around in costumes. Adults are waving their groggers, making noise, blotting out the name of Haman. Everything that isn't the normal decorum one expects in a sanctuary during worship, adding to that lampoon and burlesque feel. The fact that the last two chapters of the text go into somewhat significant detail that the Jews, after being freed from the threat of extinction at the hands of the evil Haman, in turn slaughter 75,000 innocent Persians without there being repercussions from God or human sources, without God calling for it because God doesn't appear in the book, is so completely out of character to the biblical text that it can't be seen as part and parcel. Something very different is happening here. Intriguingly, in the collection of documents known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least piecemeal evidence of every biblical book has thus far been found except for one. And that one book that's missing in that collection is the Book of Esther. And if, as some scholars believe, that the collection of documents at Qumran by the Dead Sea was actually a safety deposit repository for sacred texts during the time that the Romans were besieging Jerusalem and destroying the Second Temple, then it's entirely possible that the absence of the Book of Esther at that moment in history is no accident, that it might not yet have been seen as a sacred book, that in fact it might still have been seen as what it appears to be to the reader who reads without a religious overlay, a non-sacred book. So what do we Jews make of this holiday? We make great fun of it. We make it a kids' holiday. We make it a family holiday. The single greatest event in most communities for Purim is the Purim Carnival for the young people. Rides and games themed on the characters in Esther and the story of the holiday. Another chance to show off costumes and have fun. We make light of it, although in many communities we do find the excuse to do the social justice work of making sure that those who are in need are able to fully participate. And that's a critical element, because I think that it's possible to find, when you strip away all of the silliness, all of the exuberance and the joy and the lampoon, and you read the text of the book of Esther, what comes through, if you look at it with the right eyes, is a story of social justice. The evil Haman gets angry at a single Jew, Mordecai, and instead of taking his anger out on the man who caused it, decides instead to attempt to annihilate the entire Jewish race, and is aided and abetted in this by the hapless King Ahasuerus and his signet ring authorizing a letter of extermination. Esther becomes queen over Persia after the earlier queen, Vashti, has the temerity to stand up to King Ahasuerus when called upon to dance before his friends and show off her beauty, and she dares to say no. And for this, on the advice of his sage counselors, Ahasuerus banishes her from the palace and from the kingdom, creating a void in the royal house for which a beauty contest is held, along the lines of 1001 Arabian Nights. And Esther, the cousin of Mordecai, emerges victorious from this beauty contest to become queen, and is given only one piece of advice, one instruction by her cousin, who has been her guardian since her parents died, and that is to keep her Jewishness a secret. And so when Mordecai refuses to bow down to the evil Prime Minister Haman and show his respect, because Jews, we are told, only bow down to God, not to any human being, and Haman decides to destroy all the Jews, unknowingly he has put Queen Esther's life in danger as well. And Mordecai uses that to good advantage in encouraging his cousin to intervene on behalf of their people. And in a couple of very comedic, perhaps R-rated scenes, Esther does exactly that. So in the end, we have a story in which an entire people is blamed for the actions of one, told by the targeted people, who in turn may very well be guilty of blaming an entire race for the actions of one bad egg themselves. And the fact that Haman is not simply treated as being an individual, but as a descendant of cruel Amalek, who had attacked the Jews very early in their freedom after crossing the sea, after leaving Egypt, and attacked from behind, where our weakest link was. And for that, God instructed us we must completely blot out Amalek. And so by creating the link between Amalek and Haman, we're tarring an already dirtied character with an ancestry that is not shown to be true anywhere, but is presumed from the evil of his ways. The blotting out is carried over into the use of the grogger to blot out his name when the story is read. But we don't think about that when we celebrate, because it's a joyous, goofy holiday when we're supposed to drink and forget that 75,000 Persians died, and that there may be a significant social justice question or two or three in the story. And that's all part of the conundrum and the beauty of the story of Purim, the celebration of Purim. This lovely silver case right here behind me contains an actual text in Hebrew of the scroll of Esther, of the book of Esther. Very similar to a Torah scroll, only smaller. And as I open it up, you can see written fairly large. And this would be read on Purim from start to finish. It has long been the tradition in our congregation to read it in English so people understand it, frequently with a libretto of popular melodies along a theme. We have done things like a Beatles Purim reading, a Billy Joel reading. There have been years when we've told the story around songs written to the themes of TV shows, musicals from Broadway, all kinds of things. Vayhi bimei Ahashverosh, it begins. And so it was in the days of Ahashverosh, that Ahashverosh, who was king from India to Ethiopia, over 127 nations, in those days, that the king Ahashverosh sat on his throne of his kingdom that was in Shushan, the capital. In the third year of his reign, he made a party for all the ministers and servants and armed forces from Persia to Media. And it goes on from there. Right out of the box, the party begins. It's a fascinating little holiday. And the question of why such a book was added to the sacred canon is probably worth our attention as well. Because it turns out that prior to the establishment of Purim and prior to the establishment of the book of Esther as a canonical book, there was already a feast of Nicanor on the 13th day of the month of Adar. The Feast of Nicanor was the other holiday established by the Maccabees during the period in which the story of Hanukkah became a holiday, when the Jews regained their freedom from the decrees of Antiochus, who ruled over them from Antioch in what is today Syria. Nicanor's defeat in battle was marked by a feast declared by the Maccabean leaders. And apparently they declared many other feasts and fasts depending upon when they won and when they lost in battle, but most of those fell by the wayside until there were only two left, the Feast of Nicanor and the Festival of Hanukkah. When we talk about Hanukkah, we discover that the rabbis didn't have a lot to like in the Maccabees and the message and the holiday itself for a lot of reasons, and did their darndest to try and get rid of the holiday, but ultimately failed. So one would expect that they weren't real happy with the Feast of Nicanor either, both because of its connection to the Maccabees and as a feast celebrating a victory in battle. It would have been dangerous to their survival under the Romans, who were just itching for a third excuse to attack us, and this time wipe us out after destroying the temple in 70 and putting down the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135. And so anything that could be used to wipe the Feast of Nicanor off the calendar would have value. And it turns out that in addition to celebrating Purim on the 14th of the month, there is a fast of the preceding day on the 13th of the month called the Fast of Esther, because in responding to Mordecai's request that she intervene for the salvation of the Jews, Esther responds that she will fast before going in to see the king to prepare herself properly. And so in establishing the 14th as Purim, the rabbis also established the 13th of Adar as the Fast of Esther. It's very hard to celebrate the Fast of Esther and the Feast of Nicanor on the same day. And eventually the fast, because it was connected to Purim, won out. So it may very well be that the rabbis felt they needed to put this parody, this burlesque, this lampoon, this text of Esther into the canon to justify putting Purim, and more specifically the fast of Esther, onto the calendar. And if that's the real reason we celebrate it, then that's just bizarre. But that's totally in keeping with the theme and the tone of this crazy, overblown, jovial, topsy-turvy holiday that we call Purim. For those of you who are not Jewish, I hope that all of this puts your readings of the book of Esther over the years into some Jewish perspective, and helps you to understand how this holiday of Purim can come from the book. For those of you who are Jewish, I hope that this little slice of some of the backstory allows us to continue to just have fun with Purim, especially for the sake of our children and grandchildren. But as adults, to also find the time in preparing for the holiday and recovering from it, to take a moment to seriously look at some of the messages that come through even from a text that is such a lampoon, such a burlesque, and recognize that there are values that come from it, and therefore it was worthy of consideration and for inclusion in the canon as it was. It's one of the more bizarre holidays. It's also one of the more entertaining and enjoyable holidays, all at the same time. If you get the chance to go to a Purim carnival, I encourage you to take it, just to see what it's all about. I just ask that if it's your first experience with Jewish celebration and worship, you remember that it's not mainstream compared to our other practices at other times and in other celebrations. As always, I look forward to questions and comments. You can share them with us through the templesolelmd.org website. We invite you to join us again for the next in our series as we continue to look at the critical pieces of Jewish life and Jewish practice so that you can understand Jews and Judaism better, and we Jews can see ourselves better through the eyes of those with whom we share time and space in our world. Until then, my friends, shalom.